And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, deep in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island, the Naked City. The city, I guess, I'm told of about 360 or so thousand stories. We're going to continue to tell a few tonight. Tonight we're focusing on what I'll call the international, worldwide observation of the, if you will, folks opposing the continued violence, the war, both philosophical, rhetorical, physical war on sex workers worldwide. Originally started in 2003 as a reaction against the Green River serial killings that took place in the greater Seattle, Washington area. It's grown to an international audience. It's a somber occasion. And while we are celebrating the activities, if you will, the activism of individuals tonight, we need to always turn to the fact that people around the world have been murdered simply because they chose to engage in consensual sexual activity on a monetary level. I won't call it a victimless crime because ultimately there is no victim and there is no crime. So many of these women and men and trans engage in this behavior because it's a choice. For others, equally as poignant, it is an opportunity essentially to engage in survival. And so we live in a society that's passed federal legislation, has an overarching judicial system that would oppose folks' fundamental attempts at survival. They marginalize them, they criminalize them, they submit them to a lifetime of tragedy simply because a choice was made, either because it aligned with a desirable lifestyle for an individual, or, again, simply looking for a way to live. I'm not here to critique people's individual choices. I'm a libertarian. I believe that individuals need to make their own decisions. But ultimately, we serve and we live under a government that has become incredibly hostile. With the passage of federal legislation, FOSTA/SESTA, in just a handful of years ago, we have found government crackdowns on digital communication. We have found government crackdowns on sex workers because they attempt to conflate them with human trafficking. Statistics overwhelmingly prove that there is no connection between either. And they ignore an incredible demand, much like the drug market, an incredible demand for physical acts for sexuality. And in doing so, have had, some would say, the unintended results of pushing these folks off the streets into the quote-unquote dark alleys that some of these same politicians, Elizabeth Warren comes to mind, among many, some of these same politicians who will argue aggressively for a woman's right to choice, something that I support, for a woman's right to control her own body, unless, of course, it's used for the dangerous purposes of sexuality. We had a number of guests on tonight. Alex Andrews, SWAP, Sex Worker Outreach Project, SWAP Behind Bars, who gave us poignant examples of their outreach, their mission to folks who have been incarcerated, and some of the physical challenges and spiritual challenges those folks make, and yet, with little or no resources, have managed to provide gateways to other careers, medical support, legal support, career support, human support. We talked to Bella Robinson, who is, astonishingly enough, we think of her as a local activist, but who has gained really a national, almost an international presence in supporting sex worker rights, well, everywhere. It is my great pleasure now to introduce our next guest. His name is Paul Johnson. He is a filmmaker. And we're going to be talking to Paul a couple of times in the coming weeks, a number of times, if you will, to talk about a piece that he did called The War on Whores. It follows, if you will, and I'm going to let him tell the story, of Ms. McNeil, who is in her own right an acclaimed activist and liberty warrior. And yes, I use that term intentionally as a way of reaching out to folks in my libertarian community to understand that these folks are fighting for the basic civil rights and freedom that we are on so many other issues. But he's done a film on that, and it's gotten some astonishing results. Given our physical setup here, unfortunately we're not able to show the film, but we're going to talk about in the future is having a screening here in the Rhode Island area, if you will, to benefit organizations like SWAP Behind Bars. but we're also going to talk about the genesis of the film, the issues, and quite frankly, what it's like to do a film like this. And, you know, if you look across his resume, his curriculum vitae, if you will, how just the type of work he does, how he's able to get it done. Paul, welcome to the Coalition for the very first time.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's my pleasure to join you on your intriguing show.
It is intriguing at times. We cover what we call third rail politics. The more difficult the issue, the more likely we are to bring it up. We're the guest that ends up sitting with the kid at the kids' table on Thanksgiving for obvious reasons. Light conversation is not our forte. But tell us your story.
I'll join you there.
But give us your background, because you've been a filmmaker, but you've also been involved in network news. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to this meeting of where we are tonight.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, you got it right. I mean, my background is in conventional media, network news. I've been a television reporter since my 20s, a while ago now. And I still do that, and I still enjoy it very much. And I had been working in the United States for a number of years when I first became aware of the story about sex workers. And I was working in Denver at the time. And I was out, covering the local police as a reporter for the local television station would do. And one night they announced that they were doing a John's sting operation in downtown Denver, and we were welcome to come join them and film the results, because of course they would be quite action-filled and salacious. So they basically set up one of the classic decoy sting operations, where a female police officer goes out onto the street posing as a sex worker. A customer is lured into the situation, is brought into a room. Certain phrases and words are exchanged between the decoy police officer and the quote suspect at this point. Once they have met the legal threshold for whatever jurisdiction you're in, the door bursts open and the arrest team comes in, and this individual is arrested. And of course, having us there as the local media, this really helped to empower their public outreach program to warn prospective Johns of the dangers of seeking the services of a sex worker. Because hey, not only are you going to get arrested, but there's a good chance your picture's going to end up on the local 10 o'clock news. Say goodbye to your career, family, everything else. And I was participating in this. I didn't really know a lot about it, but what we were always told at the time was that, prostitution needs to be ended and Johns need to be incarcerated, because this is enabling this awful thing of human trafficking that's going on all of the time, everywhere. And we were told by people in law enforcement who were credible people at the time that this is a terrible thing that's happening in great numbers and epidemic proportions. And we would largely repeat that unchallenged. Not so much out of an interest in just wanting to be a mouthpiece for the local police, that does happen sometimes, but mostly because it's really hard to get independent information on this unless you do some more digging. One thing that struck me in some of these first encounters with the local police as they were arresting customers of sex workers was that, I became acutely aware that this is harsh justice for these guys. Right away, their marriage is probably immediately over. They're probably going to get fired, all for, what was essentially usually a misdemeanor offense, depending on the jurisdiction. And these were usually adult men in their 40s and 50s who were going to seek the services of a woman who they thought was an adult. So I became interested in the fairness and the effectiveness of this. And I started to pay attention to sex work in the various places I then went and worked. And I worked in Washington, D.C. and overseas and in China for a while. And every time law enforcement would have these big arrests of, a ring of sex traffickers, as they would describe it, they would really make a big deal about talking about the victim and then trumpeting these statistics that sound very disturbing about the numbers of people who are trafficked. But we would seldom see actual evidence of victims. Now, when I say victims, I mean even reading in a federal indictment somewhere, victim X was a 17-year-old so-and-so living here and made contact with the suspect. There was just this lack of actual victims. When, on the one hand, they're trumpeting this massive number of people who are being trafficked, exploited, but usually the means for arresting these people was actual known victims that we could identify in some way. I mean, and I fully respect the need to keep their identities confidential, but just even something to show that this was a real person, not a police officer in a decoy operation, which is usually what it was. So I started to wonder if there was actually a disconnect between the numbers that they were publicizing about this epidemic of sex trafficking and the actual numbers of victims. As I investigated this further through other stories I continued to do over my careers, really the way that I could get data on this was to actually meet with working sex workers. Really not hard to do that. I mean, it's harder for them to advertise now, but 10 years ago, you could pretty much find them fairly easily online. And I found sex workers, like anybody, are usually very happy to tell you about the details and the patterns of their work if you are honest with them of what you're interested in their lives. Mm-hmm. So I started to talk to and interview sex workers in the East Coast, the West Coast, across the United States and Canada. And the other thing that I started to find was not only were the women, and the ones I were talking to were women, were they not identifying as victims? None of them actually had what we would call pimps. In fact, none of the women who I interviewed not only had pimps at the time that I was interviewing them, but had ever had quote-unquote pimps. And this was mind-boggling to me because it was the complete opposite of the story that I was being told from local police in the FBI, that these women are all under the sway of a powerful, very dangerous criminal mastermind who is exploiting them. And I started to realize there's a different story here. There is a large group, a significant group, sex workers who are doing this by choice. They are not under the control of a pimp. They haven't been trafficked. Moreover, they don't self-identify as victims.
Right. Whereas
the police and the entire legal establishment says they're all victims. So I really started to become interested in this, and my reporter Spidey sense was going off here. This is a good story. And in doing more research, came across the blog of the sex worker and author Maggie McNeil, who is a prolific writer, blogger, speaker, and activist for decriminalization, not only in the United States, but around the world. And Maggie was very open with me, and we had a lot of conversations, and we hatched this idea of profiling her and the work that she was doing in Seattle, where she's currently based, in trying to fight for decriminalization. And this really blew the doors off the story for me, because having access to Maggie and her network put me in touch with groups like SWAP and Alex Andrews, who you speak with on this program. Smart, dedicated, professional, thoughtful women who are pushing back against this narrative of trafficking. Now, let's be clear. They're not denying that there are tragic, awful criminal cases where trafficking does occur. But what they're saying is that in the instances where what you have is consensual sexual activity between consenting adults, this is not trafficking, and it shouldn't be anybody's business let alone the business of law enforcement.
Right.
Started
No,
production of film, and one of the things that came to light was a very disturbing situation that had been going on in Seattle, where the Seattle prosecutor's office, we found, was getting substantial amounts of money from a prohibition group, an outside group called Demand Abolition, that was giving them money with strings attached. And those strings dictated that a certain number of arrests of clients of sex workers should take place for them to be able to keep this money. It was a couple of $100,000. It was a lot of money. And this really was an interesting scenario, because what this said was, do we have outside ideologically driven groups giving money to the police to carry out their agenda? And is this not a possible terrible miscarriage of justice? And there were a lot of people who were connected with the story, including lawyers for people who were arrested under the guise of this program, who said that this was a terrible miscarriage of justice and that these types of grants are wrong and should stop. So you're about to weigh in with a question there.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
I know, just an observation. I have found almost exclusively that the men and women that I have spoken to who are sex workers activists are thoroughly independent. They are incredibly articulate. Many of them hold advanced degrees. Many of them are published writers, published authors. In fact, I'm a political activist. I am involved in a number of causes. I can't think of a single, if you will, area, a single following, a single group of people, which on the whole have defied the generalizations foisted upon them by government, by law enforcement, to the degree that the sex worker rights activist movement has. If you are to go out, and as it's clear you have, immerse yourself in a variety of alternative media, which is almost all political, there is actually very little sexual content to it. It's all about the juxtaposition of male-female roles, about the place of sexuality in society, not defining it through the use of sexual conversations, but through the relationships, the challenge, the philosophies. It's brilliant work by a group of people who conventional media and or law enforcement would have you believe are a bunch of simpletons being led around, who are in some continually intoxicated state, who have no control over their own lives, and who are literally the 21st century equivalent of being tied to the railroad tracks by Snurdly Whiplash, waiting for the great big forces of your American government to save them, and then do nothing. I don't know that I've seen a group of people defy the public definition as adroitly as these folks have. It's really stunning. You know?
It's absolutely stunning. No, you're right. This is one of the most jarring disconnects that you can find in contemporary American society. The disconnect between the official portrayal of the state of affairs of most sex workers and the lived experiences and reality of them, particularly those who were involved in the so-called Red Umbrella movement, those who are seeking criminalization. And there's a lot of vested interest in keeping it that way, in keeping it hidden. And you might say this is coming from something called the law enforcement industrial complex.
Absolutely.
And it would be the nexus of federal police, local police, state police, prosecutors, and then an entire cornucopia of NGOs, nonprofits who are involved in couching what they're doing in this need to rescue vulnerable women and girls. And it's interesting that it's always been women and girls they talk about, not men and boys. We can talk more about that later. But saying that this needs to happen and perpetuating what those advocating decriminalization say is the myth of trafficking, or at least overstated trafficking.
And
And
if I could jump in for a second, one of the
so-
most disturbing aspects to me of FOSTA and SESTA was that by conflating electronic communication between individuals in the sex trade, if you will, for lack of a better term, which may have nothing to do with the actual procurement or execution of sexual acts, but which may be intellectual, philosophical conversations. By conflating that as trafficking, what they've effectively done is marginalize their attempts to define themselves for what they are, which, as I said, in most or almost all cases, a group of highly educated, brilliant people, almost artists in their own right, and by such continuing that downward spiral, which is completely antithetical to what their public representation of their efforts is, which is to help these people. This is literally a 21st century equivalent of, in order to save the village, we had to burn it.
Yeah, well, and here's what, and it's actually worse than that. And it's worse than that because all of these forces purport to be doing this to rescue women and girls who are in bad situations. Mm-hmm. And there are some who are. Right now, we can guarantee that there are. If you really care about rescuing the people who are in bad situations, well, first, it's a hard thing to do. But you would think the way to begin doing that would be to concentrate your resources on those people who really need it. And those people are not the Red Umbrella movement who are pursuing decriminalization and people who are clearly involved in consensual sex work. Like, what I'm saying is, if you want to solve the problem of women and girls essentially being kidnapped, what you need to do is pull the police off of investigating, arresting, and prosecuting the 90% that they do, which is people involved in consensual work, and focus on those who really need it, and to know the distinction between the two of them. And the first step in doing that is to first develop an actual rapport.
Right.
I mean, if the vice units and the detectives and the people involved in these human trafficking task forces that set up across the country really want to get the intel about who's actually being trafficked, who are the pimps, who are the bad dates, who are the people who are in peril, your biggest resource for that is other sex workers, right, and developing relationships with them. I constantly ask sex workers in the cities where they live, what kind of relationship do you have with the police? And usually that's, well, we don't talk to them. They don't talk to us. They don't want to talk to us, and we're afraid to talk to them, and for very good reasons. This is a tragic situation. Somebody like Maggie McNeil in Seattle, if I was a detective trying to find vulnerable women to get rescued in Seattle, the very first thing that I would do would be to call up Maggie McNeil and have coffee with her and to find out who knows who's in trouble, where people are, where are strolls where dangerous people are. Mm-hmm. And we've seen what happens when there's a disconnect and there's fear of the police. We get situations like the Green River serial killer in the outskirts of Seattle. This is because sex workers are afraid to talk to the police. We get a situation that happened in Vancouver more recently, and it was the Picton murders, where sex workers were being abducted and taken out to a pig farm in the outskirts of Vancouver and murdered. All of this was happening at a time when sex workers felt it was impossible to talk to the police without risking their freedom. This is a terrible, tragic situation. If people are really, truly concerned about rescuing vulnerable women, the very first thing you need to do is stop wasting your time chasing around people involved in consensual sex work and put those resources to where the problem really is, and so that sex workers will talk to you.
Right.
That's what they need to do.
Yeah, and what makes this situation even uglier in my mind is that folks now are starting to connect the dots between the war on drugs and the war on sex workers. And again, I always talk about Ferguson because of not only just the Federal Department of Justice analysis on the events of Ferguson during the riots, but also their analysis of the climate that led up to the events of Ferguson, the warlike environment between the local citizens who considered themselves literally to be hostages to an overarching, heavily militarized police department. And we saw the results. You know, to take a term from your business, we know how the movie ends, and it doesn't end well. They're hijacking the same techniques that were used on the war on drugs, the equivalent of stop and frisk, creating a hostage-like enemy environment, if you will, between police, law enforcement community, the judicial system, and the sex worker community. We just enacted laws that have incredible consequences at the federal level with a total ignorance, if you will, of any input from the multi-billion-dollar sex worker community that's supported by effectively most Americans in some form.
Sure.
We just, again, we know how the movie ends, and we're duplicating the same tragedies with the same impact, the same societal results. And somehow we're shocked that it's not going to end differently. What they have done with FOSTA and SESTA is taken women and driven them into the most dangerous circumstances imaginable because there are people who rely on sex work for survival. It's that simple. So
what we've already seen since the passage of FOSTA and SESTA is strolls that had dissolved and evaporated as online took over as the primary means through which a lot of sex workers were able to market, network, and get their services out there. These strolls have reemerged. There's one that we've been reading about, watching in Seattle, where the police are now back there busy making arrests. I mean, is this really what we wanted? Wasn't it a good thing that a lot of sex work went off the streets because of what the internet was able to offer?
Right,
and this happened in the last 15 years.
Right, and the referral services that they
we want this to be back on the streets. How is this a good thing?
Well, and the referral services that so many folks in the sex work community relied on to check references for potential clients. One of the key digital developments, if you will, that led to a dramatic increase in sex worker safety has been criminalized. How did we as a society be so tone deaf to a situation that we chose to criminalize the equivalent of a credit check for a bank? Banks don't loan out money without having that type of contact. How would we expect people who are engaged in a consensual, intimate physical act to screen their customers? There was celebration. Anecdotally, it was reported there was all sorts of celebration, and you know the term, the hobbyist. In the hobbyist community, when FOSTA and SESTA passed, because now there would be lower prices and people would be desperate. Congratulations, federal government. You sure showed us.
Sure.
Wow. We've only got a couple minutes, so I want to talk about your movie. So you took the next logical step and you made a movie about it. Not too many people can do that, by the way. So congratulations on. I look forward to seeing it this week. I just became aware of it. I did talk to people who'd seen it. The trailer is much more than a trailer. The trailer is almost a treatise in and of itself. And I provided the link to folks on Facebook so they can check the trailer out. We'll continue to share that.
Thanks.
Because I also believe, there is, to watch the movie, there is a fee where, as an artist, you are entitled to charge that. Because looking at the movie, the quality of the production, and your clear how deep you are philosophically involved in the movement, it's clear that a tremendous amount of time and effort went into this. How does one do a movie about a subject like that, maintain both the artistic integrity, have folks interested in a story that is so complex, so difficult to be told, and is, quite frankly, often the subject of caricatures as opposed to the sensitive treatment that you provided?
Yeah, it was a challenge to do this movie. As you pointed out, and I agree with you on all of those reasons. My general outlook in terms of my feature documentary film productions that I've done is I'm most interested in stories that are counter-narratives. I already have a background working in, what you might call mainstream news, which I still do and which I love and which serves a purpose. So when I'm working on these other projects, I like and I'm drawn to ideas that don't get traction in the other parts of my life. It's like a country musician who, needs to go out and play jazz or something, you might say. Mm-hmm. And this was a tough one because of the subject matter. And it took a lot of patience and persistence. And Maggie McNeil did not take a lot of convincing at first to open up and talk to me, and I think that's because she had already, made the very courageous choice of being out, of being very open about what she does, being open to the media and wanting to talk to news reporters. And it started by, talking to her on the phone, emails, and then going down and meeting her, and then spending time with her, going to their events, meeting some of her colleagues, meeting some of the other people who are prominent voices in the film and prominent in the movement, and reading as much as possible. And then, of course, delving into this strange, dark tale that happened in Seattle, where a lot of money came in from an outside group for the express purposes of making arrests. And then there was, of course, lawyers. And that was interesting because there was then a court document trail that I could then get into. And, if you're a reporter or a researcher, that's great because that's a concrete thing that you can nail down and you can sink your teeth into. And that was a paper trail that gave me a lot of clues, led to a lot of different areas that I still haven't fully explored. So all of these things came together. And 3 years after we started making it, we had the film, The War on Whores. It's now out and it's available on a number of platforms. You can rent or buy and download a copy on the video streaming service Vimeo. It's available worldwide, and we've sold copies of The War on Whores in almost 20 different countries right now. So it's actually had a fair bit of international consumption. The film is also available on Amazon.com and on Amazon Prime, and there's an interesting caveat to that. Amazon would not let us list it as The War on Whores. They said that was against their guidelines. So we agreed that because we wanted to make the film and the content available to that universe, we had to change the name slightly, and on Amazon you can find the very same movie called The War on Sex Workers.
Wow, okay.
And this is what Amazon demanded. Now, I should say The War on Whores is not something salacious that I thought up of to market the film. That's actually based on something that Maggie McNeil says, based on her writing and her experience, where she says the war on whores is the war on drugs, which is exactly what you've been saying. And soon The War on Whores will be available on iTunes, so people who like to consume content through the Apple universe can be able to get it there as well. And we're still doing screenings around the world. We've had screenings as far and wide from Washington, D.C., to Austria, to Bangkok, Thailand, and we hope many more. They've all been lively events, and we're quite pleased with the response that we're getting, both positive and negative.
Right. Because the point of art and the point of political art, if I could be so bold as to try and define what you've done just for a moment, is to stimulate not just controversy for the sake of controversy, but conversation and debate and discussion, which can lapse into controversy, and the debate and conversation can be quite heated. I'm not aware of a subject that's more controversial than the quote-unquote ethics of sex work, because it is such a trying to gain an understanding of it is so antithetical to the Christian tradition, despite the fact that some of the most Christ-like behavior of Jesus was when he quote-unquote washed the feet of Mary Magdalene, which was a political statement in and of itself. So it's critical that political art, if I could be so bold again, that it provoke folks from their comfort zone. What's the point if it doesn't?
That's a profound insight, and I share that view as well. And that's one of my intentions in this film. And I mean, what's really most interesting in this, and I've had a lot of long conversations with Maggie about this, it's where is the law coming from? Where are the directives really coming from? It's ending up in law, but it's coming from our culture. But how is it ending up in our culture? It's coming from our psychology. And it's coming from the fact that, let's face it, in the Anglo-white Western world, we view ourselves as being modern, as being beyond puritanical, but we're actually not really very much in many cases. And what we really have, one of the strong things that we still maintain is we really have deep-seated hang-ups about what we think women and girls ought to be doing with their sexuality. It's not enough to say it's up to them. We can't have that. We actually can't cope with that. We have huge hang-ups about what we think they ought to be doing. And I say women and girls because, as I've learned from doing this film, a vast proportion of sex work and sex workers are men. But in all of the propaganda that we see about the human trafficking and about the crackdowns that are going on this, they never talk about men. Why? Because let's face it, we don't care about men. Are there men who are abducted, being trafficked right now? Boys even. Absolutely. It's happening. Do we care? No. We care much less about men and boys and what happens to them, and certainly what they choose to do with their sexuality. But we really care about what women and girls do. We feel as a culture that we need to police it, have guidelines around it. We need to label people according to outcomes associated with how they use their sexuality, and these things are very deep-seated. They almost live in us, I would say, on an archetypal level. And that's really what we're struggling with, and that's why this is such an intense debate that provokes such outrage.
Right. And that you haven't even touched on the racial issue of it either, or if you will, the trans issues surrounding it. Those bring the conversation and the arguments and the rhetoric to an entirely different level, because it's if a sex worker right now is trans, if a sex worker is a woman of color and trans, they simply don't exist.
No, we don't care about them. I mean, look, here's something that I've recognized is true, and this comes from my work in the mainstream media and covering victims of terrible crimes. There's actually a hierarchy of what we care about that the media performs under, and the media performs under because society performs under. And the hierarchy is this. At the very top of the hierarchy about who we care about when bad things happen to them is young, straight, blonde, blue-eyed women. JonBenét Ramsey, Natalie Holloway. When bad things and terrible things happen to blonde young women, we go apeshit. The media goes wall to wall. It always does, and it lasts for years. We care most about young, white, straight women. And from there, the hierarchy goes on down. A couple of notches down might be white men. And a couple of notches below that would be people of color. A couple of notches below that might be adult, middle-aged men or older guys. A couple of notches down below that might be people of color who are also trans, gay, or not straight. The hierarchy goes down from there. Some might say, well, this is only created by the media and it's artificial. But it's not, because when you run a headline or a story about a young blonde woman being murdered, the number of clicks that show up on the website are much higher than if that is an older person of color. What we're talking about is deep-seated, again, I think archetypal patterns of human behavior. And this factors in to why we care so much about what women and girls do. And it's something we really need to think about and confront and face. Why do we have a hierarchy about who we care about? Why is it we don't care about the bad things that might happen to men who are in the sex trade? We really don't. But we really care if it's young white women.
Absolutely. Wow. Tell folks, we only got a minute or two left, and again, thank you. We've just met digitally, if you will, the other day. I'm so grateful for your willingness to sort of jump right into the fray, if you will, on a Friday night as we enter the holiday season. tell folks where they can find you on the web, where they can find your collective work, not just this movie, and how, again, once again, where folks can find it on the conventional social media.
You can find my work and link to my films at pauljohnsonfilms.com. You can find The War on Horrors on Vimeo.com, as I said. You can find its analog, The War on Sex Workers, on Amazon.com. And you can get access to it there. And if you go looking on both of those platforms, you can find some of my other films that you might find interesting. They're on all kinds of different topics. And I don't tend to be an issue-driven journalist. I go after all kinds of things. So that's where you can find it. And I hope if you're interested in it, I think you'll find The War on Horrors has some very contemporary and current issues, given what's going on. And also given who our current president is and what he's admitted that he's done in his interactions with sex workers.
And I use the term interaction loosely. Well, Paul Johnson, again, congratulations on this work. I'm going to speak with you offline this week about reaching out to your partner, if you will, in the firm, and having her on the show so she can testify, give her words to the community. And congratulations, I guess all I can say is on a body of work that people need to become more familiar with. And I hope we can talk again soon. And let's. The beauty of social media, I think, folks right now are taking a lot of shots at Twitter and Facebook, Insta, you name it. But I think what's clear is that the folks that I've met tonight and have been so fortunate to have on the show, without social media, I don't know that we would have ever met. And without Google, all of those things, it brings a community of folks together who are seeking similar gains, similar objectives in a way that I think elevates all of us. And I hope we get a chance to talk soon.
Well, it's my pleasure, and thank you very much for including me on your very interesting and intriguing show, and I look forward to talking to you again.
All right. Paul Johnson, pauljohnsonfilms.com. Check it out, The War on Horrors, or if you're like me and you've got the 90, what was it, $149 a year over on the Amazon site, the War on Sex Workers. It will change the way that you look at this issue. And damn it, we need to really change the way we look at this issue. We're going to take a very quick break right now. Kristen Calhoun is going to be joining us. She is with the Libertarian Party. She has organized, and I say that loosely, she has organized a caucus which is specifically geared to working within the national libertarian community to advocate for decriminalization. We are the coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and the mothership coalitionradio.us. Stay tuned. We'll be back in just a couple of moments.